a Greek, historian. He wrote a book called The Persian Wars. And basically everything not everything, but a lot of what we know about the Persians comes from Herodotus and what he wrote about in the Persian War. And this introduces us to historical bias. Do y'all know what historical bias is?
I don't even know that bias means, like...
No.
So, the idea of historical bias basically means that... Do you guys know what bias means?
It means that, like, let's say, it's basically an argument of something.
Yeah. Give or take. Do you know what bias is?
Kinda.
What would you describe a bias as?
Actually, no, I don't really know what it is.
So a bias is basically, and especially historical bias, is very important because we'll see this throughout history in several different instances, and we see it today.
Oh.
So, do you need help with that?
I'm weak.
So basically a historical bias is whenever I give my account of a historical event, but only from my perspective. And this brings about the issue of perspective, which we won't really dive into too much right now. But basically, if there's a war, right, and I'm the only person giving the account of what happened, but I'm on a certain side of the war, then everything that I say will be through a bias, will be from my perspective.
So it's kind of like So it's kind of like, let's say that there's a war between these two countries. Like maybe you're saying like the other country is like evil or something like that.
So yeah, basically like in this instance, I'll give you all an example of a historical bias. Here.
Stalin.
That comes directly from the Persian Wars and Herodotus' account of the Persian Wars. So, are y'all familiar with the movie 300?
Isn't that the one with Spartans fight other Spartans for things, right?
Yeah, so that comes from the battle of, I don't know how to pronounce this.
Battle of the Poles. Kind of unrelated. This is kind of unrelated, but my orchestra teacher can speak Norwegian.
Really?
Yeah, he can.
So,
Duma.
in this, basically, Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, said that the Spartans 300 Spartans fought out 5 million Persians. Do y'all believe this?
No, not at all, because
there's no way.
5 million Persians killing
Fighting
300 people killed 5 million Persians. No, that's bias right there.
Yeah, so exactly. So this comes back to the concept that we just discussed
There's
about
like 300 Navy SEALs fighting like 5 million natives.
historical bias. But I digress. Going back to the Persians.
It's hard. Can
Here.
you open this? You can't even open this. Come on, Mr. Worldwide. Hey, let's go.
Going back to the Persians. So here's a picture of the Persian Empire and how far it stretched. Just so y'all see, they conquered most of Mesopotamia, but they ruled with a very light touch. And what I mean by that was that,
It's Saudi Arabia. Well, nowadays Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I mean, back then, it was just a bunch of city-states and different colonies and whatnot. But, yes.
So the Persians are the orange, right?
Yeah, so the orange on that map signifies the whole territory that the Persians controlled at the height of their empire. And they basically set the groundwork for how all territorial empires are going to be ran moving forward. But the Persians were actually like a really good empire to be ruled by if you were to be ruled by some type of empire. Of course, nobody wants to be ruled by an empire, but they ruled with a very light touch. So what I mean by that is that they basically... they allowed people to keep their kings and their elites as long as they praise the Persian king, which because of that he was known as the King of Kings. And the Persians were involved with freeing the Jews in the Babylonian exile, sorry.
Oh, for the Jews, that's him.
Yeah, the Persians freed the Jews in the Babylonian exile. And this is mentioned in the Bible as well. Yeah. So the Persian king got a lot of praise in the Bible because of actually doing that. King Cyrus. So anyways, here we are. Persians are ruling, right? They're letting people keep their same form of government as long as you acknowledge basically the Persian king. They had very light taxes, so they did tax the empires that they controlled, but it was a very light tax. So even if you were taxed, it's not going to affect the development of your country economically.
Oh, so like the complete opposite of France.
Yeah, exactly, or like the complete opposite of the England whenever they were taxing the U.S. During the colonial age.
French Revolution.
But anyway, they provided infrastructure. Do y'all know what infrastructure is?
No, sir.
This is pretty. It's a pretty important concept that you guys will have to
It's the Persian Empire.
basically encounter in other parts of history. But so some examples of our infrastructure in the U.S. would be our roads, our highway system, our postal service. So basically, infrastructure are things that are put in place in a society in order to facilitate the way that things operate. So, schools are part of infrastructure. Anything that allows a society to operate progressively and keeps things moving, basically. So, if you were to start a new country, right? Say you find an island somewhere undiscovered to anybody else in the world, and you're like, "This is my country. I own it. We're gonna start a whole society here." Like, what are some things that you would need? Yes.
Houses.
Yes.
Government.
Yes.
Beams.
Yeah. So possibly that's debatable, but houses, government, financial institutions, schools, roads to get around. You're gonna need if you're moving through. So infrastructure.
Emergency responders.
Emergency responders. So infrastructure basically is all of the things that a society needs in order to operate. So the Persians would bring infrastructure into these lands that they would conquer, which sometimes were at a disadvantage prior to them getting there. So it was all fine and dandy, right? Until there were some Greeks near this area. Oh. Well, anyway, there were some Greeks near this area right here, or I guess it would be this, which is near. Well, anyway, a subset of Greeks, which before the Persian Wars, there was a bunch of city-states all around the Mesopotamia and the Iberian Peninsula. Do y'all know what the Iberian Peninsula is?
Isn't it like the peninsula surrounding the Middle East?
Close. It's more towards where Spain is at.
It's funny because of my
I think you can. Yeah, it's right near here. It's where the Mediterranean Sea is basically located. So throughout the Iberian Peninsula, there was a bunch of city-states, but these people, right? They didn't identify themselves as Greeks. They were just like, we live in different colonies, and they all had the idea that they derived from the same person, which was part of just what they believed back then. So there was a subset of Greeks that try to revolt against the Persian Empire, and they basically got wrecked by the Persians. So this made the Athenians very mad, and the Athenians decided to get involved, which the Athenians are what you would consider, what historians now consider Athens. Well, that's Athens right there, sorry.
Athens and Greece.
So Athens is what most historians refer to whenever they refer to ancient Greece. But just so you know, it was not just Athens that was considered Greek. It was a huge part of Europe, what now we consider modern day Europe. But anyways, the Athenians were like, yo, we need to get involved. Some of our people just got wrecked by the Persians, and they've been expanding their empire, so we got to do something about it. So they basically went to war. And long story short, the Persians lost, because we know this because, the Greek Empire came to be what it is today.
Then everybody died.
So once the Greeks took over, they employed some things that we now have in modern day society, and we can go through, most of those right now if you guys would like. But what are some things that you guys think? Oh, and one other thing. The Persians were Zoroastrian.
This is like school, but like more fun.
Sorry, Zoroastrian. And this is a monotheistic religion. And this is arguably the first monotheistic religion that there ever was, at least in what we know about history.
If Gabriel and his brother came in, they would not know.
Do you remember what monotheistic is? Do you know what monotheistic is?
Mm-mm.
So there's monotheistic and then there's polytheistic, which
Politics?
which the Greeks had polytheistic religions. So this is what the Persians had, right? And then the Greeks were polytheistic, and they had a system of deities, sorry. Basically, monotheistic, fancy way to say that they believed in one God.
But polytheistic means that they believed in multiple gods.
Yeah,
So, like, the
polytheistic.
So the Egyptians had whatever that is.
Polytheistic. Three of the greatest philosophers to ever exist. Plato, probably the first
Oh, I think
most
I know.
studied.
Which
The second
was
most.
the one that killed? He said to
Okay, this is gonna be misleading.
he said to.
I was ranking them in terms of impact, but I'll just give them to y'all in a time scale. So Socrates came first.
Socrates. He was the one that died or he got.
I remember I used to call him soccer.
And then
Oh
Plato.
yeah, I remember that. OG.
And then Aristotle.
Aristotle.
I remember him. I don't
Which-
remember
Wasn't he a
Plato.
student? Wait, what?
He was a
Wasn't he a
student of
student
Plato.
of Socrates?
This is where I got Aris Academy from, by the way. Aris Academy.
Oh my.
Oh, I'm so, bro. If he was still alive, he would sue you.
Yeah, probably. He'd probably sue me for copyright. But anyways,
Right in front.
out of these three, really the one that I would say, if you ever have the time or if you care to look more into philosophy, I would say study Plato. He's probably the most important one out of the three, in my opinion. Just because, Socrates is important because some people consider him the father of philosophy, but he never wrote anything. None of his teachings were ever recorded in writing, which goes to show how important writing is. So everything that we know about, or most of the things that we know about Socrates come from Plato, and he wrote a lot, yeah. And he had some pretty simple principles, which the most important one that he had that I want to leave you guys with today is think more.
Whoa, that's.
It wasn't Socrates asked more or something like that.
Socrates his whole thing was just ask questions.
Ask as many
Just
questions.
ask.
Be calm and be dumb and get executed. Should be short humors.
Socrates' his whole thing was more or less, basically, what makes somebody happy? What do y'all think?
Doing something that you like.
Yeah, that's good.
What do you think?
Enjoying something you do.
So, that's basically the same thing. But Socrates' whole main concern was with happiness, right? So he thought that people were controlled by dogmatic influences. Do y'all know what dogmatic influences are? Probably not.
Magnetic
So dogma
is my dog.
Basically, this refers to,
Sigma.
and this comes from the Greek word doxa,
Doxa.
which these two are basically the same thing. They basically refer to living with the beliefs of society and believing that because society tells you something is right or wrong, that it is in fact right or wrong. So Socrates really debated this he very strongly, and what he tied closely in with dogma was separating dogma from virtue. So you separate dogma from virtue. Does anybody know what virtue is?
No.
I feel like I've heard this.
I heard of it, but I don't pay attention to it.
So Socrates believed that knowledge equals
Power.
virtue. And virtue equals
The Bible.
happiness. What does this mean? So
That-
basically, virtue is something that we can debate all day long. So virtue comes from dualism. Does anybody know what dualism is?
Like doing two things.
Yes, correct. XD. It comes from basically is a term that refers to two different things at once, right? So dualism in the eyes of virtue, what do y'all think are the two dualistic things in virtue? Virtue is basically doing what's right. So if there's a good, there has to be what?
Or bad.
Yeah. So that's what dualism, this is what dualism refers to in this sense. You have good and then bad.
Oh yeah, because
Ukraine.
Yeah, dual, two things. So basically, what Socrates was concerned with is who decides what's good and who decides what's bad?
God.
Society.
What?
In the eyes of society, right? Because if I were to ask you, tell me what are good things?
Well, nothing's really good because somehow something good could turn bad.
Ukraine.
Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean because they're getting Trump impeached.
Okay. Well, I mean that goes back to what I said earlier about historical bias and perspectivism. But so this is also something that Plato was concerned with. So Socrates referred to it as dogma. Plato refers to it as doxa. It's basically like if society tells you what's good, what do y'all think is good, especially in today's society? Fame, right?
Yeah.
People think
Money.
if I'm famous, I'll be happy. People think if I have money, I'll be happy.
You'll be depressed if you have
If I have the, approval of others, I'll be happy.
Well, if you do something like
you
one
have-
thing bad,
If you have one comment on TikTok, you're famous. Bro, this kid thinks there's this kid's I went viral on TikTok when he had one like.
So basically,
go viral for a few.
what
in TikTok.
Aristotle tells us, and he has a book. It's called Ethics and Politics. Sorry,
The ethics committee.
it's just a book. If y'all ever want to look it up, you probably won't really want to. It's kind of boring. But Ethics and Politics, it's interesting.
Oh yeah.
So in this book, Ethics and Politics, he basically talks about how people will spend their whole lives chasing these things: fame, money, and approval of others.
Oh.
And then once they have these things, they realize that they're not, in fact, happy.
Because they need love.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
So virtue is
Get
things.
busted.
Virtue is very closely tied in with ethics, and it's basically doing what's right from a universal standpoint, not doing what's right based on what society tells you. So this whole
Because just how it's not what other people think, it's what you think.
So by the same token, society tells you being in poverty is bad, and because of that, we develop these types of stigmatizations. We stigmatize.
Eunice, nice grammar.
So in this country, we stigmatize the homeless, right? Like if somebody's homeless, what is the Western mentality?
Don't give them nothing.
Don't give them anything because they didn't work hard enough. If they really wanted it, they should have worked harder, right?
Yeah.
That's what people think in the U.S.
What
and
God said.
so we stigmatize the homeless, and we believe that poverty is a bad thing, and if they really wanted to do better, then they would do better for themselves. What this does is basically creates a very one-sided perspective on basically why these people are in these situations, and I mean, one could argue that poverty doesn't necessarily is a bad thing. You know, you can spin it to be a good thing, but none of this matters. What really matters, the whole thing that I'm really trying to get you guys to understand, is that virtue is just things that you do that are inherently good, that make you good people, you know, because you can spend a whole life chasing this, but none of this is going to bring you any happiness, because at the end of the day, the only true virtue comes from knowing yourself. And that's basically what Aristotle talks about throughout his whole, throughout his set of books, is that you should know yourself before you try to understand others. And if you don't ever take the time to know yourself, then, you know, you won't ever reach true happiness, which...
Because if you don't know what you like, you're not going to know what's going to make you happy.
Plato refers to happiness as eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. That sounds like a disease.
So eudaimonia is the concept of self-flourishing and improving yourself every day. And so what this tells us is that not every day is going to be the best day, but as long as you're aiming to improve yourself as a person, you know, and taking the time to understand yourself internally, then it's fine, because you're doing the right thing. But yeah, that's basically everything I wanted to teach y'all today
I need a pencil.
regarding